So good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us again. Welcome back to TEDxFrome, Frome for Thought. Now, 2 weeks ago, we had the amazing bee speaker and beekeeper, Paula Carnell, talking about what if what's killing bees is also killing humans. And tonight we're continuing in that theme of climate change activism. And we're really excited to have Jake Smaje joining us this evening. Now, Jake is just 25, but he's been an environmental activist since primary school, so he's had plenty of practice. He's started a conservation charity in Rwanda, and he's traveled to and worked in Kenya and Bangladesh. Earlier this year, he won an award for his 90-second speech on why Extinction Rebellion is changing the world. So we know also that he's expert at giving short talks, and he's got a bit more than 90 seconds to share with us tonight, thankfully. So Jake's idea worth spreading is for good climate activism, we need to think like a climate change denier. So thanks, Jake, for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. So environmental activists need to think like climate change deniers. And this is a really strange thing for me to say as someone who's been involved in environmental activism for as long as I can remember, really. But activism's about discourse, it's about talking to people and conversation. And to have an effective conversation, it's really important that we are able to empathise with other people and other perspectives. This isn't a realisation that I've had for a long time. It's a very recent one that comes from a slightly unusual place, and that's Black Lives Matter. There's a concept that's been really central to a lot of the work people have been doing around Black Lives Matter, which is called white fragility. And white fragility is the concept that suggests society is systematically racist. Traditionally, we sort of ascribe racism to individuals rather than recognizing it's a problem that runs through the entirety of our society. So when someone's called out for racism, they feel like it's them as an individual being called out rather than them as an individual that sits within a society that sort of taught them that that idea or that thing that someone's called racist is okay. So you can agree or disagree with the concept of white fragility, but what's important to take away is that there are narratives in our society that are really key to our identities as individuals and inform our identity. And when these narratives are challenged, we can react in lots of really different ways. So anger, sadness, silence, and denial. Denial is a really common one. It's really human. So when I say climate change denier, I don't mean it to be a word loaded with a sort of negative morality and judgment, although I really understand where people who do are coming from. Instead, I mean it as a sort of spectrum through which people minimize the science on the climate crisis and biodiversity loss, and especially the science that contradicts their own narrative of the world they live within. This doesn't just mean the people who say climate change, the climate crisis doesn't exist. The people who say it's a small issue that can be solved with some variety of business as usual. So the similarity between white fragility and climate denial is largely that people are responding to a dominant narrative of society they hold being challenged. In one case, people are thinking they're not racist despite living in a society that is racist. And the other is their desire not to connect our consumption and finite resources with the converging environmental and biodiversity crises. So our society has a really unhealthy relationship with consumption. We put it on a pedestal as something that goes along with success. And by this I kind of mean, if you were given a pay rise at work, it's very unlikely that you'd say no, but it's also very unlikely that you wouldn't see that pay rise as some way connected to sort of success, the work you've put in. And so it's really hard to sort of challenge that idea on consumption. Those who might see the pay rise as being undeserved or are lucky enough to get a pay rise that's undeserved are very unlikely not to accept it. So it's very hard for us to sort of stop that kind of constant increase in consumption. This is a narrative that we learn from quite a young age. So our toys aren't just gendered and sort of don't just reaffirm gender and racial norms. They also reaffirm consumption norms. They're sort of aspirational. So we'll give young boys Lamborghinis and Ferraris to play with, whilst we'll give young girls dolls to dress up in different clothes. And so that's a narrative that's really, really deeply ingrained in our psyche from a very young age. So it's no wonder that people react really strongly when this narrative they've been being taught since they could first sit up or hold something in their hands is challenged. Therefore, environmental activists must think like a climate change denier. We must be able to understand that feeling of insecurity that talking about climate change causes to people's sense of self, their aspirations, and their understanding of the wider world we all live within. Once we see this as something deeply rooted in an emotional reaction to knowing that normal can't be normal forever, we need to offer new, enticing, exciting ideas about what the future can look like and what the future can look like whilst addressing the sort of climate crisis. This needs to be sort of targeted sometimes at groups who find this challenge to the narrative tricky. And I think what we find with the climate crisis and biodiversity loss is these are issues that are so existential, so unprecedented in human history, that old language and paradigms don't actually work very well to describe them, and sometimes just cause more sort of more dissent. And so sort of we need to not just get rid of the language of capitalism, but also ideas like Marxism, communism, and socialism, and sort of work on building new ideas that deal with a new reality. So we need to be really specific in that to the different contexts people live within. So it's important to think on both a global level, but also on a local level, and actively listen to the concerns and the perspectives of those whose ideas contradict science. We'll find that a lot of those people actually are misunderstood, but they're also misunderstanding us as sort of environmentalists or activists or whatever label is put on it. And we'll find that the reasons for their views can often be quite challenging and will lead to changing in focus and changing the very nature of movements that try to deal with environmentalism in a really positive way. We'll find that what's so easy to cast as madness or irrationality when it comes to something like climate change denial actually comes from a place that we can all understand as being human. And I think sort of the way we react to a crisis is very different for lots of different people. So it's just trying to get everyone onto the same page. So this understanding, this empathy will help activists to create movements which appeal to diverse groups of people who don't traditionally fit into the mold of environmentalists. And I want to finish with a quick story. So last year, in October, I was at a protest in Embankment, which is the City of London, outside the Bank of England, where a group of protesters had taken the streets and were blocking traffic. And I saw this old couple, and they must have been in their sort of mid-80s, in tweed jackets and corduroy trousers, really expensive gold jewelry. Well, I don't know how expensive it was. It looked expensive on. And it was safe to say they did not look like your normal environmentalists. So I sort of went up to them and I talked to them, and they weren't environmentalists. I don't think they'd categorize themselves in that way. But they've been reading in a national broadsheet newspaper that was very hostile to the protests, but also hostile in some respects to the whole concept of the climate crisis, about the protests, and kind of felt that there was something amiss there. So they got on the train in Kent and they'd come down to London to try and find some protesters to talk to. And I had a really nice conversation with them, even though they were quite skeptical. About an hour and a half later, I heard the sound of a sort of a drumming, a big band coming around the corner. And there was a massive sort of band of activists coming around the corner. And right in the middle, dancing, was this couple in their 80s. And they saw me and they waved and they smiled. And then they continued to dance down the street with this very large group of activists. And I thought that was brilliant. It really made my day, it made my week. And any movement is at its strongest when it's facilitating conversation between individuals. We'll lose the battle, we'll lose the conversation if we let that conversation happen through intermediaries who are hostile. So Joe Cox, the assassinated MP, said, "We are far more united and have far more in common than that which divides us." And it's because of this idea that environmental activists need to learn to be able to think like climate change deniers. Because if we can't, conversation isn't possible. And we need empathy to be at the centre of the conversation.
Oh, I really enjoyed that. And your story at the end, I really enjoyed, because that really demonstrates your ability to connect with people. And I like the part that you were sort of, my initial judgment of this couple is that they're probably not environmentalists, but that doesn't matter. You connected with them beautifully anyway.
Yeah. It was a really good fun, actually.
Yeah. So much in there about how we need to move away from our focus on the consumption as a measure of success as human beings. I mean, that's such a big one. The fact that, yes, climate change deniers are really, they're struggling with feelings of insecurity perhaps, or they're both misunderstood and misunderstanding. So much to take in there. So thanks so much for joining us tonight. I just wanted to finish off by letting people know that we'll be back again next week with Caroline Weisblum's idea, which is again in this same theme. We're continuing with our inspiration from TED Countdown. And if you've not come across TED Countdown, please do look that up. There's some really great talks recently in TED's content that's really supporting climate change activism. So Caroline will be back, she'll be joining us, talking about her idea worth spreading, envisioning a positive future for our local food systems. So thanks again, Jake, and we hope that we'll see you at our applying for our TEDxFrome event next year. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for having me.